Welcome to the Thinking Podcast. This is your host, Geoffrey Wu, with my co-host, Dr. Manuel Lamb. And we're really excited to have Gary Taubes, who I think is one of the most prominent science writers in our generation today, really changing how we as a society think about nutrition, metabolism, and some of the, I would say, mythology of how we live our society. So obviously here at Nootrobox and at the Thinking Podcast, we're here to think from first principles, re-examine what works, what doesn't work, and figure out how to optimize, what we think is the most important system ourselves. So let's dive into it. Happy to have you here, Gary.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're excited to be talking to you today.
Yeah. So I think it's interesting from our arc is that, we started off in the space of nootropics, where how do we get compounds, components that optimize our cognitive function? And that led us into intermittent fasting as an interesting protocol in terms of enhancing brain-derived neurotrophic factor, one of the key elements that increases brain and neuron growth. But one of the most interesting mechanisms behind intermittent fasting is ketosis, starting to use ketone bodies as opposed to glucose or carbohydrates as our core energy fuel source. And that obviously leads into the notion around carbohydrate or glucose restriction and how that might be an interesting way to boost our performance. It seems like, that's sort of our background of how we are so interested in this space. I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how did you go from, being like, someone looking at physics to being a writer, looking at cold fusion to now being, I think, one of the leading voices of, hey, like, let's rethink how we think about metabolism and nutrition.
Yeah, okay.
What's your journey?
So, studied physics, but I wasn't any good at it, and eventually went into journalism because that's where I like the idea of investigations. That's what I want to do. I like learning something about the universe that nobody knows, which is what scientists do, but it's also what investigative journalists do. Right. So my first two books were about physicists and then chemists in the cold fusion fiasco who discovered non-existent phenomena. And while writing those books, I'm actually getting mentored by some exquisite experimental scientists about how hard it is to do science right and all the meticulous, rigorous, skeptical thinking you need to get the right answer. In three of my books, I quote Richard Feynman, great Nobel laureate physicist, saying the first principle of science, you must not fool yourself, and You're the easiest person to fool. So after I came out of the cold fusion book, the title of which was Bad Science, I had a lot of friends and allies in the physics community said, if you're fascinated with bad science, you should look at some of the stuff in public health. It's terrible. So I started doing that in the early 90s, and they were right. Everything I had learned about how careful and, like I said, rigorous, meticulous you have to be to assure you or to minimize the possibility you don't fool yourself. In public health research was considered sort of just too hard to do. It was a luxury. You're dealing with these messy systems and human beings and chronic diseases and huge exposures.
Population sizes. You can't control like all these people running around.
Yeah, and you have no idea what they're really doing and what they're really eating and whatever the variable you're trying to measure exposure to, you don't know how to do that. So we just can't be that rigorous, and we could assume we're going to get the right answer anyway, which of course the lesson from my physics days was that bad scientists and bad science never gets the right answer. Excuse me. So that was it. In the late 90s, I stumbled into nutrition research, this controversy over whether salt causes high blood pressure, and the data was really, the way I've been phrasing it lately, unless God sat you down personally and swore on his or her honor that salt raised blood pressure and caused hypertension, you'd never actually believe it from a critical look at the data. And that got me into an investigation on dietary fat and heart disease. And so this is what links into this ketosis and carb restriction is from the 1960s onward, our public health establishment was obsessed with answering this question of why why we have so much heart disease
Right.
in America. And they became focused very early on the cholesterol that's found in atherosclerotic plaques, and they decided because it's there, it's probably causal, and it's related to the fat content of the diet. So this was their obsession and focus. In my first book on this, Good Calories, Bad Calories, I tell this famous sort of story of the drunk in the street light, which is I had heard first from physicists because absolutely fundamental how you shouldn't do science. So the idea is a guy's walking down the street and he comes upon a drunk at night under a street light crawling around on the ground, and he asks the drunk, "What are you doing?" And the drunk says, "I'm looking for my keys." And the guy says, "Is this where you lost the keys?" And the drunk said, "I don't know where I lost them. This is where the light is."
Yeah.
You know? And so in modern, in the diet-related public health community in the second half of the 20th century, the light was cholesterol. That's
Right.
what they could measure. That's what they were obsessed with, and dietary fat raised cholesterol. So we end up with this dogma based on that could never be confirmed,
Right.
really, in experimental studies, that we should eat low-fat, low-saturated fat diets.
Yeah, before we get down into that, I mean, long discussion, I'm just curious, like, why do you think that, just from like a meta level, that you were, it seemed like you were like the first, if not, one of the first voices looking at actually the history of how these food guidelines and how these like industrial groups like came together to like create this system. Like, it just seems interesting from a meta level that like, I guess it's not surprising for I think people today to sort of just assume that the system has always been the system and the system is probably right.
Well,
but like, I'm curious from a meta level, like why are there so few skeptics that are just like, hey, let's just do the homework and like actually look at the literature?
I mean, I think there's a couple of cultural factors at work. So remember, I grew up I studied physics in college. When you study physics, you learn it with the history attached, right? You learn about Maxwell's equations. I mean, equations have names attached to them, and if you're learning it right, they're teaching you what experiments those people did to come up with their equations. Like, what did Faraday do? What did Maxwell do? How did what was the Michelson and Morley experiment that showed that there didn't appear to be an ether? And
Right.
what did Einstein do? And what did he build on? And then when we got to quantum mechanics, so you kind of learn it historically. Right,
So
you learn about
nutrition,
Newton, and then
there wasn't these like signposts of like this researcher definitively proved this law.
Yeah, you never learn that, so you always learn the evidence
Right.
also by which we believe what we believe. But
Right.
in medicine and public health, you don't have time, especially medicine. I don't think you have time for that. There's too much you got to learn, right? Too many fields, too many disciplines.
Yeah, I remember just through residency, I think that kind of jumping back on what he's trying to say is like oftentimes when we're in training, when I was in med school, when I was doing residency, you don't have a lot of time to review the literature. And I think that, during like rounds, they will cite a lot of studies and you just take their word for it to be true. And I think that there's some sort of like confirmation bias sometimes when they pull certain studies, but they don't pull other studies, or they don't give you like a balanced view of, okay, there's so many positive studies. Also, there's some negative studies, but we won't talk about that. And then I think that there is this kind of cultural dynamic that happens in medicine and residency training, where we sort of we're all apprentices of this master doctor,
Right.
and then we continue to perpetuate things that we learn. And we're not going to necessarily look at the literature again if Dr. So-and-so said it's true, low fat, yada yada, right?
Exactly, and that's the thing. So, in science, you're taught never trust what you can prove. And there's nothing a young scientist, I would think, would like more than to embarrass his mentor by proving his mentor wrong.
Right.
And the mentor, that's just the nature of science. It's like you're constantly supposed to be challenging everything you believe.
Right.
Again, this Feynman line, first principles, you must not fool yourself, and you're the easiest person to fool. So you're constantly asking yourself, am I fooling myself? My mentor fooling me? It's like, trust the
interesting.
data, don't trust the
Because I think
scientist.
medicine is like this weird amalgam of science, yes, but it's also like you're a practitioner. Like they're teaching you to be an operator, a mechanic on the human body.
I mean, it's going to sound radical, but is science any more involved in medicine than it is in plumbing, for instance, where you also have to learn about a lot of technical concepts in order to do your job, but you're not taught to think like a scientist. And I dated doctors in my youth, and at least two of them used to make fun of PhDs. They called them FUDs. Right. It's a different mindset. So that's part of it. The other part of it, the answer to your question is that, you're asking the question, why should I believe this? Right. And especially you guys, like you clearly believe something else now. So and when I'm writing about it, I have to understand why everybody doesn't believe this. And to answer the question why everyone doesn't believe this, you have to understand why the people who believe it believe something differently, believe that, which means going back to the evidence that they use. So you just keep going back in time.
So I guess you sort of just grew up with this instinctive, don't fucking trust people sort of
question everybody.
Yeah, and then you're kind of like, okay, let's keep... I'm just curious, like, where'd that come
it's also
from,
my
right?
first book. Okay, so my first book, I lived at CERN, the physics lab outside Geneva. That now they have this Large Hadron Collider, and they discovered the Higgs boson, or they say they did. So I was embedded with this team of 150 very smart physicists. We didn't call it embedded back then, but I was living at the lab. I was hanging out with the physicists. I was living on, for 10 months, and I watched them discover non-existent fundamental particles, and then try to figure out whether these things really were real, when they finally concluded they weren't. And the head of the experiment was this kind of Machiavellian Nobel laureate. He won the Nobel Prize when I was there for earlier work that was mostly wrong. And he was also something of a pathological liar. So his conception of the truth was what he could get you to believe that would further his cause at the moment. And if you called him on something and said, oh, that's not true, clearly it's not true, he would go, yeah, that's a good point. Then he would take a step back and give you some other false fact or alternative fact that he thought he could get you to believe, regardless of what anyone else in the experiment had said. So once you'd been lied to as a young man by a Nobel laureate physicist over and over and over and over again, you tend not to trust anyone. And one of the lines in this book, Nobel Dreams, while I was at the lab, I also took some breaks, and I went around to the U.S. and other labs in Europe, and I interviewed physicists there to get their perspective on this experiment. And there was another Nobel laureate at Fermilab, a guy named Leon Lederman, wonderful physicist, very funny too. And he told me in all honesty, he said, I like to go around the lab at night and talk to the graduate students because they haven't learned how to lie yet.
They're actually doing all the work. They're seeing the raw data.
They're seeing, and the other dynamic at CERN at this first experiment was that there were sort of two groups of physicists. When I got there, so this physicist was already claiming that he was on to this great breakthrough. So when I got to CERN and started hanging out with the physicists, there was this older group of physicists from sort of mid-level universities in Europe and England who had actually built the detector themselves with their bare hands. So they were all too aware of how the detector could fool them. And there were actually technicians who paid for it at the laboratory who had built the detector with their bare hands. And they were aware of all the ways this device could fool them. And then there were all these sort of young hotshots from Harvard and Stanford who flew in to do the analysis. Right. Once this guy had done the work that would already earn him the Nobel Prize, they wanted to be in on this new discovery, and they were doing the analysis, and they hadn't built the equipment with their bare hands. So they didn't think in terms of how it could fool them. They just they looked at sort of the signal and ignored the background. Right. So you had this dichotomy in the experiment, and the Nobel laureate only wanted to listen to the young kids because they were telling him about this great discovery, where these older people were a constant source of irritation and frustration to him. They were like downers, man. They were saying, believe me, our equipment is fooling us. Right. You don't understand it. Like occasionally a tau particle can get lost between the photo tubes. Right. Don't think it's always getting, So again, you're aware that there's a sort of that what the investigators say, and this from my earliest work, from what the investigators say and how they spin the data, it might be entirely different than what the graduate students are going to say about it, the people who actually did the work.
Okay.
So this was just how I was programmed. And when I got to the cold fusion fiasco, you had the same scenario where you had these principal investigators, these famous chemists or materials engineering people spinning the data while their graduate students were going, oh my God, how do I get out of here?
Right.
Like, how do I get my PhD and get to another lab where I don't have to do this crap because it's
Right.
clearly wrong? That was my training. So once I got into nutrition,
There's no holy totems. You were just ready to just slash down anything that just didn't come up to snuff.
Really got to be. There's another great line from Feynman where he says that science isn't about proving what's right or wrong. It's about proving what's most likely to be right.
Right.
And there's another aspect of physics that I brought to my nutrition research, which is that the physicists, when nutritionists, public health people, they talk about a meaningful effect, they use a 95% confidence level, right? Which means it's got a 5% chance of not having been. It's always hard to say this without some biostatistician getting angry at you. But let's just say the criteria that a physicist will believe for a meaningful result that's likely to be right is about 100,000 or 100,000 times as strict.
Right.
And the thinking is that unless you see a huge whopping effect, you can't really believe it's true. Right. And this is in physics, where you have these beautifully clean systems, and
like
every particle's alike.
Sigma out, right?
It's like got to be 5 sigma.
Yeah,
that's the point, as opposed to 1 sigma.
Right.
Actually, one of the joke titles of my first book was called Nobel Dreams, but one of the joke titles was going to be 3 sigma from Stockholm, because the physicists would say a 3 sigma result, which has it's got like 1/1000th possibility.
Right. Sigma
that
standard deviation, if there's a normal distribution.
Yeah.
It's like basically by random chance, like 1 out of 10,000, 1 in 1,000 possible.
Yeah, but the physicists had an unwritten rule, was called the Vernon-Hughes law of physics, and Vernon-Hughes was a statistician at Yale, and the law was that it's a 3 sigma results wrong half the time. So imagine how frequently a 1 sigma. Anyway, this was.
It makes sense, right? Like if there's 5% chance as random noise, that's literally like, 1 out of 20, which is like not.
But it's not only that.
Yeah.
The point is, it's not the random noise you're worried about.
Right.
It's all in the physics, it's the artifacts. It's the way that your machine fools you. And when you're looking at parts per billion events, you're also looking at parts per billion
noise, artifacts, random
fuck ups, and the equipment. And in nutrition, it's confounders. It's what else are these people doing when you're measuring X? Like one of my favorite examples, epidemiologic study that claims that French fries are the most fattening food there is, because you look at the population of people and what they like to eat, and you look at the weight they gain. The people who eat the French fries end up gaining the most weight. But then you could ask yourself, like, who eats French fries? Like people go to fast food restaurants, right? Or who go to Belgian restaurants, but we'll leave the Belgians out for the moment, you know? So our French fries...
correlation or causation? That's the big,
our French fries just a marker for going to a fast food restaurant, which is a marker for socioeconomic status, lack of health consciousness, and a gazillion other things that can all explain. So if the French fries were a 5 sigma effect, I would start to worry, right? And I'm thinking, I'm not eating French fries. I don't anyway, clearly. But, but if it's basically you're looking at 1 sigma is your, criteria by which you're judging, there's no way that an epidemiologic study can discern that accurately because of all these confounders. So.
100%.
Actually, I think that one of the interesting things about the Good Calories, Bad Calories book was that you go into the historical perspective, going back to the 1850s till 1960s, and can you just kind of march out like where it kind of went all wrong? Like how did we become so, I don't know, like in the 1977 we had the food guidelines, and then we became dogmatic about like low fat, but then prior to that 2 decades, Ansel Keys, and one of the things I realized when I was reading your book was that my eyes were open to the fact that medicine, nutrition wasn't black and white. Like we didn't already know everything yet, that there are actually sort of like political parties. There's like the carbohydrates is bad party, there's the fat is bad party, And then, whoever is the most passionate or the most, able to convince is the one that kind of wins. And the winners are the ones that kind of dictate history and decide what happens. So I think what's interesting is if you can kind of walk us through why, first of all, like why nutritional science is so difficult to, come to conclusions. And also, the historical, history and how we got to where we are today.
Okay, so to do that, I'm going to go further back. I'm going to go back to the very beginnings of modern nutrition. So modern nutrition, if you were to buy a nutrition history book in the 1930s, it's going to date modern nutrition to the late 1860s when German researchers create room-sized calorimeters.
Okay.
So they could measure the energy expenditure of dogs or humans.
That's like where we do the resting metabolic rate and the VO2 max, right?
Yeah, but now you're doing it in a room so they can walk around, they can sit down, they can sleep, and get 24-hour energy expenditure.
And by measuring your heat.
By measuring, oxygen.
CO2.
Okay. So from the 1860s to the 1920s, all of nutrition science is about measuring the energy. You can measure the caloric content of foods. You can see what happens with vitamin when you remove the vitamins and minerals or feed animals vitamin and mineral deficient foods or fiber deficient foods or protein deficient foods. So they're looking at vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And then you can measure calories that people expend. So this is where the street light is. We're back to the drunk and the street light. The street light is calories, vitamins, minerals, fiber, protein. That's it. That's all of nutrition science. Mm-hmm. So by the early 1900s, when nutrition people start thinking about obesity, and the physicists have been working on the laws of thermodynamics, and they've demonstrated that the laws of thermodynamics hold for humans as well as inanimate objects using calorimeters. And so they come up with this theory that obesity is caused by taking in more energy than you expend.
Calories in, calories out.
Calories in, calories out. And this goes back to the first one who I saw voice it sort of as a technical theory as opposed to a kind of, gluttony and sloth version of the theory was a German diabetes specialist named Karl von Norden in the 1900s. And that's how he thinks. And again, this is now moving into medicine. So even medicine tended to be dogmatic back then. Right. But by 1920, we've got the calories in, calories out, energy balance thinking, because that's what we can measure. It's all we can measure. So when it gets to sugar, the subject of my new book, it's like when we say sugar is empty calories, empty of vitamins, minerals, fiber, protein, and calories. It's science circa 100 years ago, man.
Right.
And science has changed. So beginning like 1920, I always forget if it's 21 or 22, with the discovery of insulin and then growth hormone. And so you start getting these real understanding, particularly in Germany and Austria, where the fields of endocrinology, metabolism, nutrition, genetics are all pioneered. And the Germans and Austrians were sort of, you could think of science as being honed to a fine edge. Like if I were to ask you guys to name me 5 famous physicists, Schrödinger, Planck, Heisenberg,
Newton,
Einstein,
right.
they're all basically Germans, Austrians, half of them
Sure.
are Jews. But these guys knew how to do science, and it's not an easy thing to do, and you've got to have a culture that really teaches you the science. So by the late 1930s, the Germans and Austrians come to the conclusion that clearly obesity is a hormonal metabolic defect. Just got to be. Like you look at how people get fat, men and women get fat differently. That tells you hormones are involved. Boys and girls go through puberty differently. It tells you hormones are involved. People get fat in different places on their bodies, and that tells
Otherwise,
you,
we'd all look the same.
We all look the
because of the
same.
hormones, we have certain distribution patterns.
Yeah, and those distribution patterns tell you that one way or the other hormones are regulating whether a cell is going to take up fat or not. It's just not just some passive acceptance of extra calories, because then every cell would do it. And if the cells do it differently between men and women, clearly that's a hormonal regulation that, men don't put on fat in their hips. Women do. Boys, when they're young, tend to get fat in a very sort of female way. And then when they go through puberty and they're infused with massive doses of testosterone, that female distribution leans out. And if they stay fat, it becomes more of a male distribution. It's clearly hormonally regulated. So obesity on some level has to be a hormonal regulation issue. And that theory vanishes with the Second World War. So pre-World War II, the lingua franca of science is German. If you want to do serious science anywhere in the world, you better be able to read German.
Right.
Ideally, you can speak it so you could go study and mentor with these people. Post-World War II, it's English. Then we want nothing to do with these people. So that theory evaporates.
Interesting. Do you think that was an effect of World War II?
Yeah.
German dogma, Nazi, bad.
Bad, yeah. And it's
Okay,
funny because when
interesting.
I was, my first book, living in Geneva, doing this physics experiment, these European physicists used to say to me the best thing that ever happened to American science was Hitler. Because he drove all these brilliant European scientists to the U.S. And in
Right.
physics, we embraced them. We had bombs to build and the Cold War to fight. You look at the Manhattan Project, it was dominated
Right.
by European Jews
Right.
who were trying to save their homeland,
Yeah.
you know. In public health, we wanted nothing to do with these people. In medicine, we wanted nothing to do with these people. A story I was told by a reliable source is that Ivy League universities had protocols in place in the post-war years so they wouldn't be overrun by Jewish academicians.
Interesting.
Okay, so, and one of the reasons Berkeley is such a great university is because they embrace these people. So this is the kind of, post-war, again, the lingua franca of medicine is now English. These people are not going to read the German language literature. They're not interested. They hated the Germans. They fought the Germans. So you have this sort of creation based on the thinking of one dogmatic University of Michigan researcher that obesity is just about eating too much and expending too little, and fat people are lazy and they just don't, if they're not willing to eat less, it's because they're ignorant. It takes a physiological defect and it turns it into a behavioral problem.
Right.
And by the 1960s, obesity is being research in the U.S. is being done mostly by psychologists and psychiatrists.
Yeah, why was the drive from Michigan to pump this psychological basis of obesity rather than a hormonal basis?
Because it seems simple. And back then they didn't. I mean, literally, most physicians didn't really understand what hormones were, how they worked, what it meant, what a hormonal. And they had the simplistic concept of how to do science. Again, so they pounced on simple answers. A simple answer was fat people eat too much.
Right.
And look at them. You could see them. They're hungry all the time, right? Therefore, they're eating too much.
And it's very easy to, again, measure calorimetry, right? Too many of this coming in and out. And makes sense from a physics, thermodynamics perspective. Okay.
But you have to go beyond that perspective. So,
and then the counter school from Germany basically was squelched because
it just evaporates. Yeah. Okay. So then what happens? 1960, Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson create the radioimmunoassay. So for the first time in history, you've got something new you can measure in endocrinology. Now you can measure hormones in the bloodstream accurately. And you could also, in 56, 3 different labs came up with a way to measure triglycerides in the bloodstream accurately instead of just cholesterol. Until then, it had been cholesterol, right? Now you can measure triglycerides, you can measure hormones. Within 5 years, we know exactly what hormones are regulating fat accumulation for the most part, and it's all dominated by the hormone insulin.
Right.
And we've started to understand all the metabolic abnormalities that associate with heart disease. So now you have this alternative hypothesis working from the Germans and Austrians, even though these people don't read that literature. They don't even know it existed. But you've got a hypothesis, if you raise insulin, you're going to raise fat accumulation. And so the sine qua non of a weight loss diet better be a diet that lowers insulin. Okay, and the way to do that is to remove carbs and keep protein moderate and boost the fat.
Yeah, things that don't spike insulin.
Yeah. So, but now you're running directly into another dogma pushed by the bad scientists, the Ansel Keys. Dietary fat causes heart disease, saturated fat causes heart disease. So if you're going to push a low-carb diet based on the basically endocrinology, the medicine, biology, you're pushing a diet that the community is beginning to think causes heart disease.
I think probably as this Ansel Keys sort of carbs are good, fat is bad movement is going, a lot of companies started doubling down on making products or making a lot of money off of food products that are in that dogma, right? Which I think is an accelerant on why this one school of thought really just monopolizing ideas, right?
Well, there's another. It's funny. By the 70s, so in the 60s, a series of tests are started to see if you restrict saturated fat, replace it with monounsaturated, polyunsaturated fats, whether you'll save lives. And the answer is they have no idea. Some studies maybe, other studies maybe not. It's certainly not a quick fix, and there's at least one huge study that shows that you get more deaths if you boost the lower saturated fat. So they launched 2 huge studies.